Hello and welcome back to the afternoon session of the conference Photographic Digital Heritage, Institutions, Communities and the Political. Broadly speaking, during the next 2.5 hours, we intend to explore how so-called authorized heritage and memory institutions have treated photographic collections in a digital context. What challenges is digital photographic heritage posing to institutions in our time, and what are some possible ways to overcome these challenges? How might institutions be able to make better use of historical photographic collections and digital technology to regenerate public interest in cultural and historical memory? And what other roles could digitized historical photographs play in the future of local and national heritage institutions? These are only some of the questions that our panelists are going to consider next. Having said that, as I mentioned earlier today, because of the relative interdependence of institutions, communities, and the political arena, the papers in the session will also help us see how institutions intersect with communities, with the political, and sometimes with both. We will take questions via the chat box throughout the session, and most of them, if not all, will be conveyed to the panelists after the session's final presentation in a couple of hours. On a more technical note, in order to be able to post questions, you need to be logged into your Google or YouTube account. And if you're watching the live stream via the main DMU events page, you will find above the broadcast window a red tab saying Stream Chat. You will need to click on this tab in order to open the chat and type your questions. And please only note that you will not be able to find this tab nor to view the chat when using the full screen viewing option. To start off the session then, I would like to invite back to the screen Dr. Catherine Troiano from the National Trust, who will be chairing the following talks. So welcome back, Catherine, and over to you.
Thank you, Gil. So in this session, we will be hearing from Christo Kefalas of the National Trust, Francois Bou of ESH 2022, European Capital of Culture, Donna Westbrett of the University of Sydney, and Debbie Cooper and Paul Herman of the Photographic Collections Network. Excuse me. We will take questions at the end of the panel, as Gil said, after all 4 talks have been delivered with the panelists together. And if you're streaming in, do put questions into the chat box. We'll cluster them and present them to panelists at the end. Although, of course, questions about specific papers are also very welcome. So first, we have Christo, who is Senior National Curator of Global and Inclusive Histories at the National Trust. Christo received her DPhil in Anthropology from the University of Oxford, studying a 19th century collection of Maori objects and historic photographs held at the Pitt Rivers Museum. Is there a bit of an echo, or is that just me? Held at the Pitt Rivers Museum to explore contemporary approaches to Indigenous knowledge and visual repatriation. She has worked as a curator at the British Museum, Great North Museum in Newcastle, and led the curatorial development of the World Cultures Gallery at the Horniman Museum. As Global and Inclusive Histories Curator for the National Trust, she is focusing on language, repatriation, and how to decolonize collections on the database. We will now hear from her about ethical questions of institutional photography in cataloguing, digitization, and public reach.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, hello. Thanks very much for that introduction, Catherine. And I hope everyone can see my slides because it's going to be hosted outside of me. Very luckily, I won't be in charge. So as Catherine said, I am the National Trust's Global and Inclusive Histories Curator. And today I'd like to discuss some of the principles and ideas we've been exploring at the National Trust in relation to images on our object cataloging database. Now, I'm not going to be talking or discussing solely historic photography as a medium, but instead I will be looking at our institutional use and digital display of images much more broadly in collection cataloging. We're attempting to move towards an ethics of images policy, or at least approach, and we're starting to think through how it will affect our object records, what visitors to our collection's online public-facing website will see in terms of our digital heritage, while also taking into consideration all of our responsibilities as an organization in alignment with the social values that have characterized the last few years of turbulent change within the heritage sphere. I am also today mainly presenting questions that we're exploring as thinking points, as opposed to presenting answers to what we're going to do. So for just a little bit of context, we have over 1 million collections located across our National Trust properties in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which spans the categories of ethnography, decorative arts, textiles and dress, archaeology, paintings, photography, and more. And unlike museum collections, the majority of the collections in the historic houses are on display for visitors to view in person, although the same cannot be said of our photography collections. So today I want to discuss a little bit about the cataloging project work that we've been doing. But before I do that, and before I start talking about the considerations of our image policy or approach, I would like to highlight that working at the National Trust has presented quite a different context of working than is typical. The acquisition methods and details for collections can be even less clear than a typical museum. The focus on a singular family as a starting point for our understanding of objects is also relatively unusual. Really key to this conversation is that we don't have a particular mission statement that defines our purpose and how we work as an institution in that museum sense. But instead, we have a broad charitable purpose, which I will come back to later. We do have policies that regulate our collections activities, such as a collections development policy, but wider ethical framings for how we engage with and care for our collections are externally defined and very broad. So we do use documents such as the Museum Association's Code of Ethics. And also, for further context, my previous working experiences have been mostly anthropological, both in my doctoral research using images, as well as the majority of my collections-based work in museums. And this is partially what has informed some of our thinking around image display through our collections catalog online. So, just to give you a bit of a summary, my previous anthropology doctoral research was a project of photo elicitation to bring images back to a Maori community in Whanganui, New Zealand. Now, that community were themselves working through historic research and wanted to know more about the collection held at the Pitt Rivers Museum, as it contained Maori taonga, or treasured Maori objects, and also historic photographic prints that the collector, Charles Smith, had either taken himself or others had taken of him while visiting him, and this documented his interactions with his Maori neighbors. Now, at the time of my fieldwork, none of the photographs from the Smith collection were available to view on the Pitt Rivers website, and many of the people I showed images to during my time in New Zealand were very interested in getting to the bottom of naming all of their ancestors in the images. And one photograph in particular from the collection entitled Group from Kaiwaiki Pa shows 14 people, including Charles Smith and his neighbors from whom he received a lot of his taonga, including the leader Te Oti Takarangi and his nephew Tamati Takarangi. And this really became a focal point for the ancestor identification. Now, in general, for that project, concerns over taonga became quickly linked to issues around the recognition of Maori ways of interpreting history and control over representations related to their ancestors in order to safeguard community well-being. And considering the community was also in the midst of a land repatriation case through the Waitangi tribunals, they were concerned with identifying the people and places that instantiated their claims to sovereignty. And these photographs helped unlock those memories, which the community had already been in the process of exploring themselves. And I'm sharing this example of my long ago research because as a doctoral student, I often took it for granted that I thought I was an unbiased participant. But in reality, while the Charles Smith collection itself was a bit of an outlier to the acquisition methods typical of 19th century interactions between Maori communities and European collectors, I was not being attentive enough to the salvage paradigm, which was the typical mode of operation under which many photographs or objects ended up in museums, and where Indigenous knowledge was separated from the groups, and that cultural knowledge is something that many groups are seeking to reclaim today. The majority of participants in my research also saw me as a direct representative of the Pitt Rivers itself, and they often conveyed my institutional responsibilities to these images. And key to these responsibilities was a need to maintain community control and consultation over how the images were used and interpreted to ensure the representation and use of names for people and places was accurate. There was a substantial diversity of opinions in the community, however, amongst how to share these images and whether they should be shared more widely at all, given that familial consultation and rights should take precedence in the decision-making process within a Maori community. Now, contestation of the past occurs frequently within the encounters between the state and Indigenous groups when objects or symbols are misappropriated or when memories are subsumed within the national rhetoric of history. So there are key questions that arise around the digitization of that cultural heritage. Now, at the National Trust, there is a distinct tension between our very broad charitable purpose, which is conserving heritage on behalf of the nation, which in this context, the nation means England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, while we also want to ensure that digitized object images, as well as photographs, remain respectful to origin community wishes. And at times, this charitable purpose can be relevant for the people who live within this nation, but many of these questions of respect and representation pertain to communities overseas whose heritage concerns do not explicitly feature in our general charitable purpose. So can I have the next slide, please? So I want to give you a little bit of the background to our collections management system project and the cataloging work we've been doing. In general, the framing for what we've been thinking about and what we've been doing has been through the lens of decolonization, which of course isn't new to the heritage sector or unusual, but it has been an unutilized way of thinking about the Trust's histories of place and collections up until recent years. Decolonization as a practice demands that those working in heritage recognize the requirement of engaging in ways that respond to the needs of Indigenous communities, but also extends to the institutionalization of colonial norms and inequalities that affect communities of color. The approach for our cataloging work in this instance, though, is through a wider lens of reparative justice regarding colonial extractions of art and mapped onto wider issues of historic representation. These issues must extend to the peoples whose migration or forced subjugation was part of the colonial expansion project. Museums have increasingly acknowledged the need for practices that include the voices of wider non-white audiences and marginalized communities whose collections and historic images have traditionally been on display, but whose voices have historically been silenced. So on the screen, you're seeing a few of the objectives of our current cataloging project. And you'll see that a lot of them are very language focused because it has been a very language focused project for us. And this is partially because when we first put all of our collections and their available images online for public access, there was a decision to just push all of the existing collections management system information out to the public, which was unedited and often partial. This means that problematic language exists in the way we describe art in relation to race, especially, and identity. There are problematic titles with unqualified offensive language, and we also have images without descriptions that contain offensive and triggering words or upsetting depictions of communities of color. Now, classification is not immutable, and categorization systems are important to challenge. And using any catalog inventory in a museum as a way of ordering and keeping track of things, especially when collections are extraordinarily large, really does serve a useful purpose. But the problems around the catalog are the entrenched constructs that have been standardized around its use, such as a demand for a single source of authoritative terminologies, conformities of description, distanced and non-emotional language to enforce a tone of institutional authority, and the imposition of Western epistemologies onto global material cultures and traditions. Now, for us, while conversations about a need for this work had been taking place since I joined the Trust in 2018, the political events of 2020 proved to be the quickest catalyst towards action. In light of greater awareness raised in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement, our work was accelerated towards a focus on histories connected to slavery and colonialism, as well as the impact on people of color. And in the wake of Black Lives Matter, some institutions, including the Trust, made statements that they will become actively anti-racist. Now, this revitalized social focus on systemic racism in institutions allowed us to engage in real actions and methodologies to address language on our collections database. And some key areas that we focused on in 2020 were collections depicting people of color, either real or fictional, racist stereotypes or caricatures of people of color, collections that were taken by documented illicit means, collections with direct and documented links to histories of slavery, collections that indicate a Black presence in the British Isles, explicit depictions of empire, as well as depictions of people of color, specifically in poses of subjugation or forced servitude, where it's clear that agency is not present. Now, also on your screen, you will see a poster of one of the objects that is part of the cataloging project. And I won't go into too much depth, but as I said, it's been a very language focused project for us. And if any of you are interested in seeing kind of what has happened in terms of these objectives that are on your screen, you should feel free to go to the National Trust Collections website and even just type in the free text box, poster advertising the Tate Gallery, and you'll see a really good example of the kind of work that we're doing around these objects. And specifically for this Tate poster, it was a lot less about what the verbal linguistic description was of the object, but what we very much did not say at all about the racist caricature, which is in the top left of that image. Now, before I do go to the next slide, I just want to give a quick warning that the images that are on this next slide are caricatures of Native Americans. And this will become relevant because I'm going to describe the kinds of things we're thinking through ethically around these types of collection images. Can I have the next slide, please? So, as I said, this was a very language-focused cataloging project for us, but what we realized quite quickly is that addressing visual language is much more nuanced and complex. Namely, we wanted to ensure that the images of our collections would not contribute to distress for viewers, which itself is a subjective experience and very difficult to create policy around. We have been considering either removing images or creating holding images that need to be clicked on so that you can view the image behind it for many categories across our collections. Now, I won't talk about all of the categories of images that we've been considering for restriction today. Instead, I'm going to talk about the ones that are most pertinent to the cataloging project where we've been able to actually address language for these particular records. And so for those particular areas that I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to discuss stereotypes and caricatures, depictions of subjugation or forced servitude, collections that are connected to implements of slavery, as well as discriminatory language visible on an object. So from the previous slide, you will have seen that one of the principles of the language cataloging project was that we needed to acknowledge that many of our depictions of people of color are caricatures or racial stereotypes, and that has been reproduced through toys, drawings, paintings, ceramics, and in many other ways. And while we're working through our records and attempting to add an item level acknowledgement to each record where we find this kind of visual depiction, there are key questions that we're thinking through. And I mean, just the high level one is just, does a stereotype or caricature demand a content warning before looking at its image? And we're thinking about this mainly because we want to try and think through a decolonial lens, through an anti-racist lens, and we want to be recentering the well-being of the community of origin depicted. And for example, on your screen, you can see in the upper right-hand corner a photograph by Hallam Ashley of the caricature drawn by George Townshend of a Native American family. And I think a key question around our decision making in terms of displaying racist stereotypes of people is also around context. I mean, we're asked this all the time, is what's the wider context? What's the historic context? Now, from that caricature that you can see on the screen, it is true that George Townshend made caricatures as his art form, and in general, he didn't solely focus on a particular cultural or ethnic identity. But herein lies part of the problem, and that if we are truly trying to recenter the well-being of the community of origin depicted, then we should not be trying to discern the intentionality behind the art that is being displayed. Instead, we need to just continue to think from the point of view of the people viewing that item and what harm it might potentially cause. And I think another follow-on question from this kind of line of questioning about stereotypes and caricatures is, would we even be considering restricting the view of these reductionist 18th and 19th century images from public consumption if there were an abundance of realistic images that represented the agency of Indigenous communities? And the reason this line of ethical questioning feels important to me is because it also relates to a question around the role of heritage institutions who preserve nationally recognized historic narratives. We need to ask ourselves continuously, how can we infuse our places with histories of people of color to support agency that goes beyond the stories of oppression? Now, in doing the cataloging work, specifically around items like this, we did look across many collections trying to discern who might be applying restrictions to their content or images within cataloging. And in reality, we couldn't find many examples of institutions who decided to restrict images of caricatured peoples. But instead, we did find really great examples where the nature of the stereotype or the caricature was made very clear via words in the title or the summary description of an object with a clear acknowledgement. And there's another image on your screen in the left-hand corner. Now, this is a stereograph print depicting a village of Klinkwan in Alaska and the community. And this is one of the items from our Fox Talbot Museum in Wiltshire. Now, this isn't an example of an image that I'm specifically thinking through in terms of culturally restricted knowledge, but it is here to note that as we continue to explore our collections more and make images available online, working with communities will be an important part of the next step of our inclusive approach. And we do already have a few instances where we have very clear religious restrictions that have been alerted to us, in the sense that we know that it's probably best to remove or at least restrict an image and its view on our public collections on our database. But I think we'll have to continue for the moment to keep treating this as a case-by-case basis as different things arise. But what is critical to this kind of image is acknowledging the many ways that a museum, in the general sense, acts as a vehicle for outdated notions of presence and absence in society. And it is also key to consider the historical, political, and social contexts in which photographs were produced and subsequently used. And I'll just give you just one more quick warning about my very next slide, which contains the last few objects that I will be talking about in relation to our image work. One of the images is a monochrome negative of depicting actual enslaved individuals, and there is also a direct implement of slavery on the next slide. So may I have, please, a change of slides? So real depictions of enslavement and subjugation is another area that we're considering the ethics of displaying, especially in relation to the pain and violence that you can explicitly see. But again, setting an overarching precedent for how we approach this medium and subject has been tricky. We looked to different collections across the sector in the UK and the USA to see how other institutions have handled such images. We haven't found much in terms of a uniform approach to photograph collections of this nature, but as I mentioned previously, the photograph collections are not as readily available to view in our houses. And that means that if we have a digital image of a photograph that has been uploaded to our public-facing website, that is perhaps one of the only places you can view an image such as this for research, or even in a more abstracted way, where the presence of that collection item can have any representational light. Now, I think it's really important that we intellectually engage in this present moment of time, which is really acutely looking at an exploration of politics and power as well and visual culture. But also, we need to ensure that we update our content in a way that doesn't erase or hide the reality of pain, oppression, and exploitation. So it feels like a very fine balance, and we don't want to keep contributing to the erasure of the discomforting parts of the past that enables any kind of historic sanitization. And another item that's on your screen, and one that has received quite a lot of attention from our cataloging project, is a neck shackle, and that is at Snows Hill Manor in Wiltshire. Now, the idea of potentially restricting the visibility of this image wasn't led from a digital approach, but actually led from an on site visitor experience approach, as we have decided on site that this direct implement of slavery should have an advance warning for visitors on site so that they can read about the item before they actually enter the room and they can choose to avoid it if they would like to do so. Now, I think it's just an important point because institutional policies do need to be connected up through all their outputs. So this interpretation decision has then informed our thinking around how we might signal this content to viewers of the object online as well. And again, in searching through external collections websites, we didn't find many examples of restrictions to this kind of visual footprint for implements of slavery. And one of our key exemplars for cataloging was the Smithsonian Museum's African American History Museum. Now, while they did have images of shackles and chains and other related items freely visible on their collection's website, they have a very different institutional history and recent formation in comparison to ours at the National Trust. And while we are starting to acknowledge our more complex histories, I think our organizational identity remains the same: a white British institution entrenched in perceptions of power and privilege. And I think more than ever, this kind of complex institutional history is coming to the fore in everything we do. And it does require us to think slightly different, in a slightly different context in terms of our responsibilities towards the potential harm that our collections hold. Now, the very last object that I'll talk about is a stoneware tobacco jar that is held at Moseley Old Hall in Staffordshire. Now, as we were doing a language project around our collections cataloging, and it's what has informed most of our searches and how we address things on the catalog, the key collection items that initially triggered our thoughts around an ethics of imagery also focused on offensive and discriminatory language visible on objects. Much like the stoneware tobacco jar on the screen from Moseley Old Hall, our initial language searches brought up an array of collection items where offensive terminology was inscribed on an object itself, and therefore the photograph of the object contradicts our attempt to remove the unnecessary racist language that had found its way into the catalog. For many of our photograph collections, manuscripts, or library collections, they might include written captions or terms of descriptions that are now considered outdated or derogatory or culturally insensitive. And we can't edit out or modify those original captions or titles for historic accuracy. And they also reflect and document the standard of language and attitudes at that time. There are surprisingly more instances of this than we thought in our object records. And as a project that was initially driven by language and a focus on words, this still feels like an area where we need to make important decisions around the visual impact of words. Whereas a lot of the language work we are correcting on our database is the correction of human choice. Choices that were made about language and descriptions in the 1980s when these objects were first being documented on our older database system. So, when language is part of an object, should we consider that certain words shouldn't be displayed openly or at least require restriction? And so there's one more larger looming institutional question in the back of my head that always lingers in terms of our specific institutional identity. And that's that most of the stately homes that come into the trust's possession were in lieu of inheritance tax. Now, the houses and belongings that were given in lieu so that they would be held on behalf of the nation in perpetuity, that specifically tells me that that taxation money and those resources didn't go back to benefit the country in any tangible way. So I think it accelerates and kind of heightens our responsibilities towards these collections so that they can measure it against a maximum benefit for people in a socially accountable way. So I'll just draw this presentation to a close by clarifying that we haven't implemented any of the restrictions to the way images are presented on our public-facing catalog yet. And there are, of course, arguments that by warning people of something potentially distressing before they see it, that you may cause further harm by increasing their emotional vulnerability or increase their anxiety before they see it. And I think it's important to remember that it's our institutional responsibility to constantly engage with the heritage we care for within an understanding of social and political contexts that makes the collections relevant. And as an organization, it is necessary that we recognize our role in the negotiations of identity through collections, as well as our role in affecting the normative ways of thinking about history, as decolonization practice has no finale. Thank you very much for listening.
We're waiting for Catherine to come on screen now.
Thank you, Christo. That was a fascinating talk, and I look forward to coming back to some of those points in the panel discussion at the end. But next we have Françoise Pousse, who is Director of Cultural Programmes at ESH 2022, European Capital of Culture. Françoise is a researcher of visual culture focusing on photography, memory, and identity. Heritage collections and archives of national interest are recurring subjects in her work. Most relevant examples comprise her research on the National Amateur Film Collection at Luxembourg's Centre National de l'Audiovisuel, excuse my bad French accent, and her work on Edward Steichen's interpretation of the Farm Security Administration collection for his 1962 exhibition, The Bitter Years. More recently, she started to explore the collection of photographs documenting the dismantling of the Fortress of Luxembourg, held at the Musée National d'Histoire et d'Art Luxembourg. I think this is what we will be hearing about today in her talk, Fortress Walls and Legionnaires, Digital Cultural Heritage at the M3E Luxembourg. So welcome, Françoise.
Thank you, Catherine, for the kind introduction. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you also for including me in this panel, and thanks Jane and Craig for helping with me with the slideshow. I think we can start with the first slide. Exactly, here we are. So I'm just going to share a few thoughts of digital cultural heritage in Luxembourg at a particular museum at the M3E. And as you said, Catherine, the talk is titled Fortress Walls and Legionnaires. I would like to start by giving you a bit of context on the next slide. An overview, actually, of the structure of my presentation. So first, a bit of context, the M3E as a museum, why it has been created. It's a new museum. Then also, importantly, in the context, digitization as a national policy. I want to just explain a little how it began embracing digitization at the museum. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time with one particular photograph, La Percée de l'Avenue Monterey, which is about the dismantling of the fortress of Luxembourg. And by the way, I added this Google Earth view of Luxembourg, where you can see the bird's eye view of what today is quite a green city, but all the green spaces around the inner core of the city used to be fortress walls until the Treaty of London in the 19th century. So, and then as a last part of the talk is then how digital cultural heritage policies or technologies evolved, also with the appearance of a new player on the field, the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History, the C2DH. We seem to like numbers here in Luxembourg. And then also with a last exhibition, a recent exhibition, Legionnaires, a collaboration of M3E, C2DH, and Studio Takonoma. And then we can go on to the next slide. So this is Musée Drei Echelon, the M3E. M3E stands for Drei Echelon, 3 acorns that you can see on top of the fortress towers. So M3E is a relatively new branch of the Musée National d'Histoire et d'Art, dedicated exclusively to the history of the fortress and the identity of the Luxembourg people. It is located in a historical fort and opened its doors in July 2012 after 15 years of very heated discussions and a painful planning phase. The press referred to it as a hot potato, the museum that nobody really wants or for which there visibly is no actual need. Yet the M3E is the first national institution offering more thorough analysis and interpretations of the becoming or the evolution of Luxembourg, of which the history of the fortress is a main component. This educational mandate linked to memory and identity and to creating cultural cohesion as well is even more important, considering that in Luxembourg, the history of the country is only marginally taught at school. So children in Luxembourg, as strange as it may seem, learn about French, German, or European history in a more general sense, but the official school curriculum leaves many blank spots when it comes to the history of Luxembourg itself. So the M3E has a huge gap to fill, and in this endeavor, digital technologies and digital heritage have come to play an increasingly important part. Then also important to know for the recent context, so digitization as a national policy transforming and modernizing the country has been a major focus in national policies in recent years, and digitization of historical documents and artifacts is an integral part of this concerted effort, and the overall goal being optimal accessibility and the creation of a digital heritage available to a large national and international audience. And then we can go on to the next slide as well. So here we are inside the M3E museum, and in one of the main galleries. So the M3E embraced this policy of digitization early on, starting with the digitization of photographs and historical artifacts. What is important to note here, however, is that digitization at the time for the Musée National d'Histoire et d'Art, as well as for the M3E, exclusively meant digitally photographing objects and prints. So there were no 3D scans. Three-dimensional artifacts and material visual objects alike were turned into high-resolution but nevertheless flat image surfaces. A first main objective of this digitization process for M3E was to give access to a database of audiovisual documents to explain the fortress in a few clicks, as can be read on the museum's website. So the database can be consulted in the museum via an interactive multimedia display that you see here on the slide, and in this particular gallery, in that gallery dedicated to the multimedia display, it consists of 2 tactile screens allowing the visitors to explore and to zoom into historical documents and maps. So as you also can see on the screen, it may have been, this installation may have been state-of-the-art in 2012 or during the planning phase. Unfortunately, 9 years later, as is the fate of most fixed digital installations, it looks a bit clumsy today. Also, the access to the collection is still only limited. What is important, however, this first step toward a digital collection and a consistent digitization policy, combined with the wish of the museum to immerse the visitors into a compelling storytelling environment, also led to a new thinking about historic photographic objects. In other words, historic photographs that previously would only have been exhibited as originals now could appear in an enlarged, cropped, or otherwise digitally manipulated form to enhance the scenography or the storytelling if needed. And here we can go over to the next slide. So therefore, it is also no coincidence that next to the multimedia display in the permanent exhibition, we can see a large-scale lightbox with a reproduction of an 1869 photograph documenting the first breach into the fortress walls. So this photograph that you see in the back with the title La percée de l'avenue Monterey, which would translate into breaching open of Monterey Avenue, documents a pivotal moment in the history of Luxembourg, the dismantling of its fortress walls. It represents the capital of the country as it prepares to transition from a closed fortress to an open city. So in 1867, and we can go also to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in 1867, the fortress of Luxembourg, a 9th century-old strategic stronghold in the border region of today's France and Germany, was dismantled according to the terms of the Treaty of London to signal the end of the city's use as a military asset. Because of its crucial geographical position on top of a rock, which made force access almost impossible, the original small fort had been repeatedly reinforced as the greatest European political powers, the Holy Roman Emperors, the House of Burgundy, the Habsburgs, the French and the Spanish kings, and the Prussians, so everyone basically, successfully occupied the site from the 16th to the mid-19th century. And on the next slide, we will have a view exactly of the fortress of Luxembourg, so what it was in August 1875, when the dismantling actually had already started on different other parts of the fortress. An interesting fact, also information, so under Prussian occupation, photography had started to develop in Luxembourg. Studios had set up shops inside the city walls. They responded above all to the need of self-representation of the members of the garrison stationed in town. And today, only a small number of portraits, unfortunately, of soldiers, or bourgeois family are known to testify of this early period of the history of photography in Luxembourg. And also importantly, the first city view is only dated as late as 1859. Why this lateness? There is a quite simple explanation. The fortress was classified a military asset, so taking photographs was simply not allowed. The dismantling of the fortress, however, marked a pivotal moment in the history of Luxembourg and called for thorough documentation. And there we can go to the next slide, please. So the signing parties of the Treaty of London wanted proof that the promise to demilitarize Luxembourg was kept. Photographs could deliver an accurate representation of the situation, and most importantly, they could be reproduced, and as what Bruno Latour would later call immutable mobiles, they could be sent to various recipients in different countries and not be changed. So here is the original digital reproduction of the original photographs, where you can see the first breach into the city walls. So this photograph, La percée de l'avenue Monterey, stands out as a highly symbolic representation of the opening of the city and the changing identity of the country, as a key memory of the dismantling, but also as an important testimony to 19th century photography in Luxembourg. The photograph had to have a prominent place in the permanent exhibition of the museum. So a high resolution scan was made of the original 16 by 26 centimeters print of the photograph, and the scan allowed for a massive enlargement of the image, so it could be printed onto a semi-opaque PVC support and presented as a 2.50 by 3.45 meters backlight installation in the exhibition, so over 200 times the size of the original albumen print. And here we can go to the next slide and see the view once again of the exhibition installation. So we see, compared to the original, that the framing has been slightly cropped to focus on the center of the image and a group of people posing on the debris of the city wall. The effect of this digitally remediated photographic object is an imposing rendering of the scene, luminous and imposing, turning the historical moment into an immediate and graspable slice of life, and as such transcending the meaning of the original print, which, by the way, is also shown a bit further in the exhibition display. So yes, we know that photographs have been rephotographed, enlarged, and cropped for a very long time, and that these interventions have been used systematically to create dramatic effects. But in the case of the M3E and the photograph of the dismantling of the fortress, I would argue that it needed this very particular constellation, which was the coming together of first the mandate to tell the history of Luxembourg and to connect the citizens to their past. And then second, an immersive storytelling practice in exhibitions that is getting more and more common. And then third, a general and national push to use digital technologies in the framework of mediation of cultural heritage. So the scenography and the use of the photograph is still today quite effective. Many visitors are compelled to come closer, many realizing for the first time that the green and open city of Luxembourg had been confined and locked down for a very long period of its history, and therefore changing perspectives on the perception of a common past. So the next part of my presentation is going to move forward in time to discuss more contemporary cross-media storytelling practices in the museum. And so I think we can go on to the next slide. And with the newest exhibition, Legionnaires, but also developments in the museum of the Dreiechen M3E, and new policies of exhibition policies. So over the years, the Musée National d'Histoire et d'Art and the M3E continued their digitization projects, expanding their online collections. More and more artifacts can now be accessed via their websites, still only as two-dimensional image surfaces though. So however, it is possible to visit permanent installation galleries in a 3D mode, and visitors can explore the complex system of underground tunnels linking the different parts of the fortification via computer screen. At the same time, the museum continued thinking about how to engage the public through immersive shows and to fulfill their mandate. Most of the exhibitions, however, remained quite traditional in their format, and the use of digital technologies was only marginal until very recently. Actually, a new player appeared on the cultural scene in 2016, bringing new dynamics into the field of digital history and digital heritage in Luxembourg. And we can move to the next slide, please. Following the government's Digital Luxembourg policy, the university created a research center for contemporary and digital history, the C2DH, and it's focusing on research on analysis and public dissemination in the field of contemporary Luxembourgish and European history. It promotes an interdisciplinary approach with a particular focus on new digital methods and tools for historical research and teaching, and today the C2DH employs over 60 researchers and faculty members. Public outreach or dissemination is of particular interest for the C2DH, and since its creation, researchers have worked together with cultural institutions in Luxembourg on a regular basis. A collaboration with M3E, investigating the role of Luxembourgers in the French Foreign Legion, started 5 years ago and resulted in the temporary exhibition Légionnaire, which opened in April 2021, so this year's. The questions addressed were: who were the Luxembourgish legionnaires? What were they doing in France? Why did they decide to enroll? And how were they portrayed and remembered? Digital technologies play a crucial part to mediate the topic. A vast selection of photographs, documents, films, and objects have been scanned and made fit to be integrated into an immersive exhibition landscape. And here I want to show you the exhibition trailer, which gives a good impression on the use and the role of digital cultural heritage in the new exhibition design.
On entre à la Légion bien souvent comme on entre au désespoir d'argent, désespoir d'amour, désespoir d'honneur. On y entre par dégoût de la vie, par dégoût des hommes, de soi-même.
Monsieur le Major, j'ai pu me convaincre que la Légion étrangère compte un nombre relativement élevé de soldats d'origine luxembourgeoise.
Dieser hatte früher ebenfalls in der Fremdenlegion gedient und schilderte mir das dortige Leben in den rosigsten Farben.
Un appel aux amis de la France. L'heure est grave. Tout homme digne de ce nom parle.
Aux Luxembourgeois. Les Luxembourgeois en résidence à Paris, profondément indignés de la violation de leur territoire par les Allemands, protestent avec la grande énergie de cet acte criminel.
À notre papa chéri, nous voulons, moi et mes petits frères.
C'est la fin de la guerre. 1919. C'est le triomphe.
Ostert, 14 août 1921. Par la présente, je vous prie de bien vouloir me faire donner des renseignements sur mon fils, Jacques Weimerskirch, qui depuis le commencement de la guerre s'était engagé comme légionnaire dans l'armée française.
Perfect. Thank you. I think we can move on also to the next slides. There we had the exhibition trailer. Exactly. Thank you. So for Legionnaires, the C2DH itself teamed up with the Italian studio Tokonoma, who defined themselves as an experience design studio that connects people to brands and cultural institutions through meaningful interactions. The studio collaborates with different professional figures such as curators, architects, musicians, and sound designers, programmers, illustrators, graphic designers, and set designers. Through audio and video storytelling, the use of different media and interactivity, Tokonoma wants to enhance cultural heritage, historical, artistic, architectural, archaeological, and intangible, as they say on their website, through its reinterpretation and representation in a new guise. So it is about creating an experience, about getting the public on board and getting the public interested in historical subjects in this case. The aim is to create evocative experiences around themes of collective interest, such as memory, history, communities, and identity, by manipulating media and playing with reality and perception to develop to develop multi-layered visual sound narratives that open up to new interpretations. Photography, as is visible in the exhibition trailer, becomes part of the whole experience. Photographs are animated or digitally enhanced, mixed and matched with other media. They float across the screens. It is less about the one photograph that could trigger a reflection or a reaction than about creating experiences to increase public participation through combining interactivity, multi-vision, story fragmentation, and space design. For the Legionnaires exhibition, the description of the scenography is the following. After the balance and rigidity of the first room, the darker and fragmented interior space hosts stories that seem to spring from every corner, revealing themselves together with the objects that represent the protagonists. The audiovisual narrative of the 6 audio-video installations surrounds the viewer, who is guided through the history of the French Foreign Legion, told through archive videos, composed landscapes, and original soundtracks. So I am getting to the end of my presentation. I think the step from the first displays, the first use of digital technologies to mediate heritage until the very recent steps are definitely interesting. I myself actually have many questions concerning also this scenography, these use of an immersive exhibition display, and also the creating of experiences. But I think that this museum that nobody wanted in 2012 has since its creation been able to evolve into a space where history can be made accessible to national or international visitors. Previously untold stories start being revealed and connections to the past can be established. Here, digital cultural heritage technologies play an increasingly important part. What I find very interesting is that stimulus for new ideas come outside the museum from researchers and academics. Also, expertise for immersive exhibition design comes from abroad, as the Legionnaires example shows. The idea of a network I find really interesting, a network around exhibitions telling national stories, where photography, material or digital visual objects also play an important role. So this is also something that drew my attention. Photography maybe not so much as evidences than as triggers or keys to open doors to the past. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. And next we have Donna Westbrett, Associate Professor and Chair of Art History at the University of Sydney. Donna is author of Photography and Place, Seeing and Not Seeing Germany After 1945, which was published by Routledge in 2016. And she is co-editor, along with Natalia Lusty, of Photography and Ontology, Unsettling Images, which was published by Routledge in 2019. Her recent research has been published in the journals Photography and Culture and Photographies. And Donna is a recipient of the 2017 Australian Academy of the Humanities Ernst and Rosemary Keller Award, research leader for the Photographic Cultures Research Group, and editorial member of the Visual Culture in German Context series published by Bloomsbury. I'd also like to say thank you, as I know that Donna is in Sydney and it's very late there. So thank you for being available, I think, at about midnight to be giving this talk with us. And we look forward to hearing her talk now titled Operation Overlord, Civilian Photography and Artistic Mediation.
Thank you, Catherine. That was really lovely. It's nice to see you. And thank you very much, Gil, also for inviting me to speak today. Just going to swap to my screen. Okay. So first of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I am presenting this paper on land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land that was never ceded and to elders past, present and emerging. In March 1942, the Director of British Naval Intelligence, Admiral John Godfrey, made a public appeal to the BBC radio to the nation. In his address, Godfrey called on listeners to send pre-war holiday snapshots and postcards of Europe and its coastlines to the Admiralty. While it seems from various reports that this call for holiday photographs was presaged on the promise of an exhibition or competition, in reality, the War Office was looking for photographs, maps, and tourist data about particular places of potential military interest in France. Godfrey's call to the British public resulted in over 80,000 people responding with holiday snaps of France and other locations across Europe, plus postcards, photo albums, tourist maps and guides, to form a comprehensive photographic library that by 1944 totaled nearly 10 million images and ephemera. Relevant photographs were incorporated into briefing materials, along with maps, aerial, zero elevation or wave height images that were then issued to assault troops in preparation for the invasion of France in June 1944, codenamed Operation Overlord. Over 150,000 of these were reconstructed into maps of the European coastline by cartographers working at Oxford University on behalf of the Inter-Service Topographical Unit, or ISTD. The success of the Normandy landings of D-Day, which led to the liberation of Western Europe from German control, was in no small part due to the work of the ISTD and the use of this vast archive of photographic material. While the photographs and postcards were largely returned to the British public, over 750,000 original and reproductions, briefing papers and ephemera remain in archives such as the Imperial War Museum, the Royal Geographical Society, the D-Day Museum in Portsmouth and the National Archives. Over 70 years later, German photographer Simon Menner gained access to the Imperial War Museum archive in order to digitize part of this collection for a photographic project. Menner, who has long worked with archival materials such as photographic records of propaganda, surveillance and conflict, managed to scan a number of these photographs before the archive retracted their offer, for reasons that have actually not been made apparent. Left with a number of digitized photographs and no rights to reproduce them, Menner decided to significantly alter selected images by applying a censoring black rectangle over sections that featured people or identifiable structures. This visual intervention actually recalls the secrecy of the original mission and use of such photographs to plot an invasion that would contribute to the end of the Second World War. It also signifies the inherent difficulties of collaborating with museum and heritage institutions and foregrounds policy, legal and procedural impediments to digital access, dissemination and indeed the diversification of digital heritage. Complicating the matter is the problem of determining any intellectual property rights in relation to what amounts to mass vernacular images that ideally could be classified as orphan works. Despite the significance placed on these photographs at the time, they remain largely undigitized and unpublished, other than those in wartime reports by the ISTD. This paper foregrounds this under-researched area of British national legacy of family holiday snapshots in light of political manoeuvring and the digitization efforts by German post-war artists. It also considers the tensions between the ongoing political and institutional conflict surrounding digitization of declassified material, and also Menner's photographic intervention as a protagonist in the ongoing efforts to access formerly secret or confidential government material that is derived from vernacular citizen photographs. Held in the Imperial War Museum archive are 3,741 cardboard boxes of photographs, postcards and ephemera showing pre-Second World War topographical views of locations across Europe. Each box is labelled in black ink and catalogued under a single collection number. Collected by the ISTD, the collection includes material taken by various official operatives or those obtained from the British military, shipping companies, businesses, newspapers, tourists, photo agencies, university collections, etc., etc. In addition are those of interest here, snapshot photographs and holiday postcards from members of the armed forces, civil servants and members of the public in response to the BBC call to the nation. Of specific importance are images showing the seaside town of Aremonche-les-Bains and the beach and cliffs of Longues-sur-Mer, both geographic sites that were located along a 10-mile strip of coastline in Normandy, on which the British 50th Infantry Division would land on 6th of June 1944. The collection of photographs was considered by far and away the largest and most valuable of its kind ever assembled in Britain. As Wren Ginger Thomas recalls of her time working for General Morgan, Chief of Staff to the Supreme Allied Commander, the rooms at Norfolk House were covered in postcards of Normandy pinned to the wall. A considerable number of these postcards and photographs were reproduced and included in briefing documents over 1943 to 1944, such as the most secret booklet titled Small Ports on the Normandy Coast, featuring aerial photographs, maps, geographic locations, tidal data, and possible berthing locations. The images provide a human perspective to the data as a way by which users can actually identify specific locations from eye level. Similar images were reproduced in the English Channel Handbook, including a postcard of the area of Port-en-Bosson, a location that at the time would barely have differed from the 6 renditions of the harbour painted by Georges Seurat in the 1880s. Family snapshots such as these are actually not destined for use in secret missions, but are rather viewed by a small number of family members, or in the case of postcards, viewed and collected by holidaymakers. The photograph of Donville-les-Bains of the mother and her 3 children seen here is evocative of its everyday depiction of a family on holiday. Behind the group is a low cliff with what appears to be beach huts on the ridgetop, depicted as 104 in the ISIS report on France, which you can see on the other side of the screen. This image is now in the archives and digital collection of the Royal Geographical Society, along with several others reproduced from this same report and used for orientation at the D-Day landing. Collecting nearly 10 million such snapshots and postcards from the public by the War Office called for an intense bureaucratic methodology, not unlike an ethnographic project for identifying and sorting topographical images and significant heritage sites from across Europe. This undertaking equates today with digital-based or social media activities such as crowdsourcing and Google Maps, building up a larger picture from a myriad of smaller ones. Instead of being available online in an open source environment, the Operation Overlord photographs are stored in cardboard boxes wrapped in string. And with very few of these images digitized at the time of writing, only one is available online from the IWM collection. In contrast, the D-Day Museum hosts a number of records online that are extensively annotated and linked to other records, forming a narrative and historical framework to the collection. The different approach taken by the D-Day Museum in making such records available online is likely related to the scale of the collection holdings, the Focus Museum Charter, or an enthusiastic staff member. A vast and repetitive archive such as these is, according to John Tagg, accumulated to the point where the format barely varies, but where the smallest deviations may be noted, classified and filed. And yet, as Tagg also posits, such accumulations are never enough. In other words, all accumulations of visual data are left wanting. Simon Menner, who has long been interested in visual renditions of structures of power, such as photographs of the Stasi, global media, terrorism, and censorship, and on receiving advice that IWM could no longer support his project for reasons possibly related to privacy and reproduction limitations under copyright law, Menner chose to alter his digitised versions via a redaction method, which he actually applied by hand with paint. In other words, he created a mashup from the original material in his visual appropriations. Such redaction processes obscure sections of a document or image, causing specific information to become unreadable or unrecognisable. The redaction itself draws attention to that which has been occluded and yet remains recorded in the original document. As Catherine Biber understands it, whereas redaction might be regarded as a tool of transparency, it is the visible attempt to reconcile secrecy with disclosure, and in the hands of Menner, it indicates engagement with both concepts. First, the redacted photographs point to the original secrecy surrounding Operation Overlord and the call for citizen photographs. Second, they foreground issues of access to and disclosure of historical and political records, including original or digitised material, by drawing attention to the wide use of censoring processes, such as redaction or withholding access. As early as the 1920s, Hilary Jenkinson wrote that archives are textual and linguistic, but they are also visual, textural, and now digital. Seeing a photographic print or negative object with its marks, fault lines such as creases or tears, and inscriptions is an entirely different endeavour to seeing a digital reproduction on a screen. Hence, objects in digital files have different lives, material qualities, and interpretive possibilities. Although the original photographs may provide a window into the historical narrative of D-Day, Menner's adapted reproductions intrinsically provide a reflexive narrative of their own object and non-object lives, and of past and present bureaucratic or political processes. These original prints exist alongside the digital versions online in much the same way as the archive itself continues to exist in multiple object and digital copies. Along with others who work in this way, Menner self-consciously and purposefully engages with political ideas about government transparency and secrecy, in addition to provoking engagement with institutional limitations in creating digital heritage from cultural assets. So an example of this kind of work that I'm talking about is this postcard of the seafront at Eremont-le-Bain in Normandy, which was taken around 1905, which you can see on the left side of the screen. Menner's rendition is actually divided into 3 vertical zones, comprising a black rectangle situated in the middle third of the image, obliterating this portion of visual information. On the left of the rectangle, we can see a row of houses and hotels with stone and metal fences butting up on the promenade. On the right lies a surging sea, the hint of a large wave and a cliff face featured in the distance, with the obstruction here obfuscating a powerful storm wave that hits the sea wall. This erasure draws our eye to the obliterating redactive mark, but also to the reason for the inclusion of this particular postcard in Operation Overlord. In other words, why is this image significant? Atlantic storms were actually a regular feature of this part of the coastline, so much so that those at the Admiralty who were planning the invasion of June 1944 employed weathermen to assist in predicting an opportune window for the landing. As Caddick Adams points out, the weather was considered a matter of national security, and hence public weather forecasts were not issued by either side for the duration of the war. Weather forecasts drew on a range of sources, including reconnaissance flights, ship observations, UK weather sites, but also from the Germans, who were unaware the British had broken their weather codes. On June the 4th, weather maps actually showed a violent storm brewing with low cloud predicted, which would prohibit the use of airborne troops. Despite the hurricane conditions on June the 5th, Eisenhower, who worked out of the Southwark-based naval headquarters, announced they would invade the following day to coincide with low tide and full moon. While June the 6th proved to be a day of sunny skies and mild winds, the only other window of opportunity for the month coinciding with fortuitous moon and tidal conditions was actually the June the 19th, on which it turns out the British Channel saw the biggest storm of the 20th century, a once in 40 years event, recalling the major storm that lashed the Calvados coast in 1905 that we saw in the postcard. The digital erasure then of the turbulent wave from Menner's photograph foregrounds this momentous story of national security, in which even weather reports were withheld. As an appropriation of a reproduction from an original postcard published in the early 1900s, Menner's photograph draws together three significant weather events: the 1905 Calvados storm, as symbolised by the postcard, the June the 5th, 1944 storm that preceded Invasion Day, and the alternative Invasion Day of June the 19th, that brought a major weather event to the coast of Normandy. And you can see all of these events depicted here. The photograph also brings us to the very location of the invasion that itself had been manipulated by the creation of two artificial harbours in order to control the weather for the safe landing of the Allied forces. The narrative elaborated here, drawn from the inclusion of this seemingly banal image in documents for the invasion of France, maps the image to numerous war history accounts of the significance of weather to the invasion plan. What is often lost in the process of making cultural heritage available for public access online is the corresponding data that assists in mapping images such as these across various archives, repositories, historical accounts, or artistic interventions. Indeed, opportunities to develop digital heritage are constantly stymied by the lack of cross-institutional asset mapping. A successful example of such a database, which is cross-institutional, is Trove, hosted by the National Library of Australia in Canberra. This actually has over 6 billion digital items and has several hundred partners right across Australia, including libraries, museums and galleries, media, government, organisations, and a whole lot more. It's an incredible resource. And on the one side here, you can actually see the search that I did of Operation Overlord, which brought up 112 results from newspaper articles, books to photographs and maps. With the long-term practice of artists drawing on such archives for their work, what potential could be realised in the opening up of archives and heritage collections to such interventions? Furthermore, in what ways can institutions make better use of historical photographic collections and digitisation technologies, from data mapping or Instagram, to generate public interest in cultural and historical memory? There is great potential to use location data included on the images, together with images, other images, information booklets, documents, and other ephemeral material from various institutions such as the IWM or the National Archives, in order to undertake a digital mapping process as a way of bringing to light this historical event and offering a new way of thinking about citizen investment in D-Day. And on most of the photographs, actually on the back, there is the actual location that the photograph was taken, plus the documentation from the collection itself. So together with projects such as the Mass Observation Archive, material such as this has a significant role to play in terms of narratives of nationhood and history, but also in recording personal and collective memories as a means by which institutions can bring their collections to life. So an example of this are two projects that I'll just briefly mention here from colleagues in Australia working on a major digital humanities project. This one here, which was created out of the Australian National University, of a digital edition of de Labor's illustrated songbook, exploring the interrelation and interactivity of images, music, song, and textbooks and actual text in the songbooks. So you can actually see the images themselves, the various metadata that has been built around these images. You can listen to all of the songs which have actually been recorded by an opera singer, a soprano, the music sheets themselves, and you can also read the transcriptions. So I encourage you to have a look at it. It's an incredible project. Likewise, a project on the Magic Lantern in Australia maps images by maker, format, and collections with original notes and contemporary performances. So Martin Jolly has actually performed these magic lanterns on many occasions in which they actually transpose and shift as the viewer is engaging with the images. Again, a kind of very unique way of thinking about how one can engage with images in archives. In contrast, Menna's photographs both remake and reimagine the original images by provoking an engagement with political and legal institutions. Hence, the series makes complex the very idea of archives, how they are accessed physically and digitally, and the ways in which such repositories become essential to the dynamics of cultural and historical engagement. How can we reconcile the increased focus on materiality with that of digitised objects of cultural heritage, between maintaining the object and setting them free? One solution is the intervention of artists or, in fact, other creative users who rewrite, retell, reframe, reimagine, mash up, edit, or incorporate archival objects into diverse media in often challenging ways. Such tensions mediate the encounter with digital heritage and instigate a different type of distribution, consumption, and seeing in relation to heritage assets. One could understand such aesthetic interventions and appropriations as making a significant contribution to expanding connections with and access to digital heritage. Rather than merely digitising copies of photographs and postcards from the IWM's archive, Menna's endeavour achieves what Sassoon refers to as a complex cultural process of translation, or a change between forms of representation. If, as Sassoon posits, a photograph is a multi-layered object in which meaning is derived from a symbiotic relationship between materiality, content, and context, or indeed photographic meaning, in what way does digitisation and appropriation of such images alter these central aspects? By what means are various discursive systems in which an image is contextualised in terms of its past uses and meanings transformed in the move from object to image? I would argue that Menna's transliteration of archival images as interventionist appropriations rather than a direct digitisation invests new meaning and simultaneously reinforces the presence of the original images in his analogue partial obfuscation of the scene. Furthermore, these appropriated images foreground the photographic intervention as protagonist in the ill-defined space of declassified material and digital heritage. His work also raises questions such as, what do photographs actually tell us of events in the past, if relevant contexts and tensions are no longer extant? And what are the ethics of seeing formally secret documents? Furthermore, in what ways can the imaginative reuse of vernacular images draw attention to significant historical events and drive institutional and political change? These questions have real implications in terms of textual and visual readings of formerly secret documents, in that redaction and digitisation both enable and complicate interpretation in the present. Mena has achieved something significant with his own renditions of these heritage assets, in that he has brought to light a significant event in British history. As he notes, in undertaking the project, at least there will be something for others to start with, other than dusty boxes in a storage building that's not accessible. By requesting access to these obscure records, Mena has brought this significant period of history and British national legacy to public exposure through his digitally mediated photographic renditions of heritage assets. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. One thing that I would just like to remind everyone streaming in is that please do feel free to put any questions into the chat box as they might come to you. I know that we are going to be saving those questions for the panel at the end, but that doesn't mean that you can't be plugging them in as we go. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Debbie Cooper and Paul Herman, respectively Manager and Founding Director of the Photographic Collections Network, which aims to support the UK's photography collections and archives and share specialist knowledge. In addition to her work at the Photographic Collections Network, Debbie is currently also a part-time producer for Format Festival in Derby. Previously, Debbie worked as a fundraising manager for Museums Sheffield and as project manager and artist in residence at WW Winter Studio. Paul is also the director of Red Eye, a network that has supported hundreds of photographers to develop their photographic work and careers through a programme of events, courses, commissions, collaborations, business advice, and information. We will now hear from them, discussing how we might think towards a distributed national photography collection. Welcome, Debbie and Paul.
Hi, thank you very much, Catherine. Can you hear me okay?
Hello, thank you very much.
Welcome everyone, thanks for coming along. I'll start and I'll hand back over to Debbie in a few minutes. I'm Paul Herman and here's Debbie Cooper, as you can see. And as Catherine said, the Photo Collections Network is a support organisation for anyone working with photo archives and collections. And we cover the UK, so that's our area of discussion today. And we're exploring ideas around a distributed national collection of photography in the UK. And what on earth does any of that mean? Well, the idea of putting a national collection or collections of photography in a central place has been discussed for more than a century, with many schemes planned but never happening. Our talk, in a nutshell, is about speculating how we might broaden the idea of what constitutes a national collection. I think it makes it more feasible and likely to happen, but have a listen and see what you think. And we very much welcome comments, thoughts, and ideas at this stage. I'll start with an abbreviated history of these discussions. And if we have the next slide, please. Many of you will know about Helmut Gernsheim, who amassed an incredible collection of photography after World War II and wanted to give it to the nation. And he started lobbying for the formation of a national collection and got as far as making an arrangement with the National Trust to house it in Osterley House to the west of London. Next slide, please. Here is Osterley. Can you imagine that? Wouldn't that have been made a difference? But the deal founded on institutional politics and the relationship between the Gernsheims and the V&A, and the collection ended up being sold to the University of Texas. So next slide, please. Some years later, in the early 1970s, there was widespread talk around the setting up of a national photographic archive and gallery. And the then government took the view that a single archive or national gallery of photography wasn't appropriate. Viscount Eccles, the Minister for the Arts, when asked if there'd be a national photographic archive, simply replied, no, photographs are best collected in a number of archives with special objectives. And the then Education Secretary, someone called Margaret Thatcher, expressed the opinion that photographs form an essential part of the archive and working material of most, if not all, museums and galleries. And it's for each of the national museums and galleries to decide on the relevance of photographs to their function and appropriate collecting policy. I'm pretty sure, I mean, I can't be certain, that Eccles and Thatcher, they had a long history of saving money and avoiding alternative centres of power, both of which are fulfilled by these decisions. But they also opened up the discussion of what else might be done to look after photographic works. And around the same time, there was new work emerging on mapping and documenting all of the collections that my colleague Debbie is going to talk about. So over to you, Debbie.
As Paul's mentioned, around the same time as the parliamentary debate, Dr. John Wall from the Royal Photographic Society started his new work on a directory of British photographic collections. Next slide, please. This is a link just here that will take you to some excerpts of this lecture that I'm just going to briefly read out. So if you want to look that up, you're very welcome to read the full lecture, which is, I think, 17 pages, but really interesting. So this, like I said, was the same time as a parliamentary debate, and it emerged from his interest in the National Photographic Record Archive. He'd been concerned for quite a while about the care of colour photographic materials in particular, and was keen to re-establish this concept of a National Photographic Archive. There was a conference hosted by the RPS in 1972, which acknowledged the dangers to certain collections, but decided the time was not right to establish an ambitious central photographic archive in colour. However, they recognised there was a prior need to record existing photographic collections, and in order to identify those under threat, not just from risks of care, but also risks of sales and those leaving the country. And there were areas where the records were distinctly lacking. The conference by the RPS resolved that a register and index of photographic collections should be compiled, and that under the Royal Photographic Society, they agreed to take this on board. Dr. John Wall said at the time it was a measure of their naivety and understanding and underestimating the complexity of this task that they originally set themselves a budget of only £250 to do this project. There was then a high-profile Sotheby's sale of David Octavius Hill and Robert Adamson's work, which, following on by an article in the Times, was then saved by the National Photographic Gallery. This led to a campaign by the Times and sponsorship of £16,000 to set up the National Photographic Record. This £16,000 back in the 1970s actually translates to over £200,000 today. And their principal objective was the compilation of the directory. To that end, officers were established in both London and Darlington, staff were engaged, and the laborious business of recording began. They sent out more than 17,000 questionnaires in multiple formats, which would establish to owners and custodians of every conceivable kind of photo collection. The task took 4 years to complete, and the directory was then published in 1977. This work collated some 1,600 of Britain's most significant collections, which were detailed under 13 heads of information. Subject ordering of the directory demanded a new creation of an entirely novel, numerical and computer compatible, of course, don't forget this is the 1970s, so that's a heck of a lot of work, classification system for the photographs, as the Dewey system was found to be inappropriate. To enable this project to happen, the National Photographic Record had to work with the Museums Documentation Association to devise this record card specific to photographs and photographic collections. And of course, that still influences much of the way that we look at photographs today. The directory, of course, was necessarily selective. It represented just the tip of the iceberg of data that they collected from the 17,000 questionnaires and other sources. Not only did the directory project identify areas which are well documented, but it identified areas that fell between the cracks, objects and events of daily life which went unrecorded because of their very familiarity, and they were lost to posterity by default. Coming to now, nearly 40 years on from Dr. Wall's lecture and his research and work, the same risks to collections exist, and that's why we're driving this project forward now. The same rationale for the creation of directories not changed. Multiple collections are under threat from care, but also from sales, and the work of a directory of photographic collections is still required, not just to help save collections, but also to drive public access, interest, increase value and understanding of photographic collections. Back over to you, Paul.
So next slide, please. I think we've got a picture of the John Wall archive. Do you want to talk about that briefly, Debbie?
Yeah, so the collection is split between the UAL and the V&A. So the photographs and the images that were used in the record of the publication, of course, those that weren't included are all held at the V&A, and the many of the surveys and the index cards and this computer and system and record system is all held at UAL. It's an absolutely fascinating archive and still is valid today to help us understand so much of the collections that are and were available in the UK.
Thanks. And you can still get the book, actually. It's worth a look just to see the work that went into it. And it's sort of like the Yellow Pages, no images at all. Next slide, please. So in our chronology, we come to the 80s and 90s and the setting up of a body called the Committee of National Photographic Collections, the CNPC. And their remit was to provide a voice for the dozen or so institutions that held what they regarded as the most important national collections. And they produced this book, Our Photographic Legacy, Treasures of the National Photographic Collections, in '89 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the invention of photography. And it had 150 images in it. And wonderful as those photographs are, it's also clear that they're a limited and somewhat mainstream representation of the whole of photographic history in the UK. The chair of the CNPC, Committee for National Photographic Collections, in its later stages was the late and very much loved and missed Pete James. And Pete and I had long conversations about how the committee came to an end. It was closely connected with its inability to expand, which is a familiar characteristic of closed networks. I think it's fair to say some of the concerns were about the breadth of photography and the difficulties of catering for the wide range of public, private and commercial collections and archives. Next slide, please. So in the 2000s, we saw something called the Renaissance Review, which is interesting because it was a review of Renaissance in the regions, which was a sort of longish term policy for museums in the early 2000s. 2009, the review was quite strongly critical of the subject specialist networks, which was effectively what the CNPC was. The review said subject specialist networks lacked a clear purpose. They lost sight of public engagement, often were top-down organised, didn't seize the opportunity of dynamic connections, and fell back on traditional collection mapping technology. And then round about the same time, as you'll see from the next line, the photographer Jem Southam also worked on this problem. And he realised that the photos and negatives of his friend, the photographer James Revilius, were effectively gathering dust on the shelves of Record Office. Jem imagined that many more photographers' archives would be likely to meet a sad or neglected end if more action wasn't taken. Next slide, please. So Jem, with Val Millington, set up the Photographers' Archive and Legacy Project that aimed to provide case studies that would inspire living photographers to think more about their legacy. Next slide, please. In 2014, it says there, and that must be true, I arranged a discussion at the suggestion of Professor Francis Hodgson at the National Photography Symposium. And the session was called Opening Up the Nation's Photographic Collections. And we discussed what institutions could do about the relative lack of access to UK's collections. And a colleague from Arts Council England, Denise Farmy, was in the audience there and suggested that the network I ran at the time, and still do, Red Eye, being out of London, open to all, fairly democratic, was well placed to restart a subject specialist network. To cut a very long story short, we did, and the PCN Photo Collections Network is the result. The comments from the Renaissance Review were ringing in my ears throughout, and my colleagues from different organisations at the time. I was determined that PCN would be as open and accessible as possible, and that anyone with a collection, really from a shoebox under the bed to a museum, and including born digital archives and collections, could benefit. At the time, Red Eye started to make stronger use of databases and CRMs, customer relationship managers. And if and when the PCN started remapping collections, we'd aim to make the best use of digital technology to allow for a much more dynamic and inclusive map than previously possible. I had a bit of a light bulb moment. We ran a visit to a public collection of photographs, and we were in a room full of amazing old photographs. And one of the people who came to that event was standing next to me, was an archivist working for a private company. And she picked up an album of photographic prints and said, "We've got the negatives for these prints," which set me off on a train of thought. a characteristic, obviously, of photography is that photographs can sit in publicly owned, privately owned, charity, education, and other hybrid ownership models of collections, all at the same time. And collection mapping, if done right, could refer to those myriad links and interconnections that emerge from how photography is. We might find ways to vary the granularity and level of detail that was just not possible with John Wall's approach. It isn't about just what's in a particular collection, but also the ownership, licensing, and dissemination of, and relationships between that material. And also we might be able to make better use of our broad community, as has been mentioned, to contribute to information about archives and collections. And from that, we might be able to start rethinking what a genuinely wide-ranging and inclusive national collection might be, which I'll come back to shortly. But first, back to Debbie to give a little bit more detail about our work on mapping.
Next slide, please. So just before COVID hit, we were incredibly lucky to get a small amount of funding from the National Archives to run a testbed project. This was in partnership with Photography in the Archive Research Centre, which is based out of LCC, part of UAL, who have the John Wall collection. This funding enabled us to assess and preserve the digital archive of the Directory of Photographic Collections, which was a project that was delivered by Park in the early 2000s, which stepped on ahead from the work that John Wall had done and started to create a digital database. And we also wanted to learn from the work that John Wall had done with the RPS in the 1970s, assess, like I've mentioned, the work that Park had done and the previous iterations. And we also wanted to deliver a series of workshops that enabled us to work with the public and the sector to explore what the future of a new online directory could be. Next slide, please. This is the work that Park did in the early 2000s. So they started to use some of the work that John Wall had done and do their own new work to reach out to collections and try and do their own version of mapping. Next slide, please. It listed photographers and the institutions where their collections were held. This being the early days of the internet, very quickly it became out of date. And although a huge amount of work was put in by Val Williams and Bob Pullen on this, it quickly became obsolete. Some of the links still work, and the work that they did is incredibly beneficial to the project going forward. But we were able to learn from this and understand how we could maybe approach the next stage in the project. Next slide, please. We ran a series of online workshops. Next slide, please. Which using Jamboard, which is a great little online tool for sticky notes, we worked with a range of people to explore what a directory could be, what a new one could be for now, hopefully with longevity, and how it might be used and what we might need from it. Next slide, please. The people that we included were researchers, curators, gallerists, lecturers, editors, journalists, artists, conservators, auctioneers, publishers, students, writers, and the general public. And this is ongoing. We're really interested in how we shape the new directory. Because one of the things that we noticed as we've researched this, and we've done a lot of research, Paul and I and Brigitte and others, into the previous iterations, is that each time it's been started with someone who's passionate about saving photography, but it hasn't necessarily been started with the users. And we wanted to start this approach with who would use it and why, and how do we set about doing this and make it as future-proof as possible. Obviously nothing is future-proof, but if we work with as many people as possible and draw in people's ideas and needs, we've got the best chance of making this functionable for the future. Next slide, please. We asked people some really simple questions about when and why you would use it, and we really hoped to be surprised by this, and we were. We thought that if we talked to enough people and spoke to them about why they would use it, what they would want from it, what they would need from it, the ideas that we hadn't have thought about would come about, which is exactly what happened. Next slide, please. Some of the reasons why people wanted it, we understood. As Paul's mentioned already, the connecting prints with negatives. Also, researching provenance and ownership and copyright, but also understanding about historical context, which we possibly hadn't thought about, that was really important. Locating obscure material, lesser represented subjects, choosing works for loan, and public inquiries for museums and archives as well. Also making sure that it was available for creative practice. For photographers to use this and artists, it needs to be something that's living and breathing. And for the directory to have the best use in the future, it needs to be something that people genuinely need, want, and are happy to use, and also to be part of and regularly update. Next slide, please. So we asked people what information they would hope to find, and we had a plethora of answers. Next slide, please. In particular, where negatives are held. One of the issues, as I'm sure we all know, with photographic collections is they're often split across different archives, sometimes thematically. For example, if you're looking for photographs of trains, there might be some in a railway museum and archive. There might be some in an archive that's particular to a locality. It's very rare that photographers' entire collections are kept together. As I mentioned, biographical information, the sitter and subject identification. There's all sorts of things that we really would like to know about a collection that enables it to be a living, breathing and working record. Next slide, please. Our additional thoughts and observations was the bit that Paul in particular worked as agent provocateur and posed questions and thoughts and drew out as much information as possible from the groups. It was really interesting, the sessions with curators and artists who often had the blue sky thinking and wanted very exciting ideas to happen for it. And when we worked with researchers and university staff, often they were giving us lots of ideas about how to make sure that it was future-proof and giving us the potentials of where the pitfalls were. Next slide, please. The questions that came out were incredibly inspiring and also helped us to really think about how this works going forward, making sure that things like it could link to the National Archive records, that organisations who've already been doing quite a lot of work to make sure that they've got open data, they'd connect to those. There was lots of worries about how it would be beyond the risk of commercialisation. And for something to have longevity, it needs to be cared for in the long term. How do we make sure that Google can't supplant it, that it's future-proof? And of course, longevity means sustaining the infrastructure. But these sessions, funded by the National Archives, have been incredibly useful to give us this real grounding about how we can take it forward and what we need to be there at the very heart of it to make sure that we can go forward. At PCN, we have been running our own version for many years through our website of people being able to add their own collections. And now with the data we've gathered and our sessions, we can really address some of these questions that people have put forward. Next slide, please. We would really love it if those of you listening today could be part of the research. You can scan this QR code with your phone. We can also put the link into chat shortly, and you can help us answer these questions and pose thoughts and questions, give us positive and negative feedback, help us drive this project. Next slide, please. Back over to you, Paul.
Okay, thank you very much. I need to just mention that we're kind of using the word map and directory more or less interchangeably at the moment. Obviously, they are slightly different, but I'm sure you get the point, and we'll see more about what we mean. But now it's my chance to basically speculate on what might be done with this work as we progress it. And I'm presenting it here purely as ideas in progress, and would very much like to hear your thoughts. But firstly, I just want to consider what happens if we do nothing. If there's no mapping, no directory, no further attempt to refine how we think of national photographic collections. As has been mentioned, there's already plenty of other ways that people can find out about photo collections and archives. The web gets more and more searchable. State organisations are getting better and better, libraries, museums, archives, to allow people to drill down into and explore their holdings. It's worth a quick look at, for example, at the National Archives here in the UK, which has an amazing set of collections that sits within that. But I would say if we do nothing, we basically get CNPC Mark II plus Google, if I can call it that. In other words, an expanded committee of the big institutions with search engines on top of that to allow us to look in more detail. But the problem, obviously, with that is so much gets missed. Small and some private and vulnerable collections and archives are very hard to find this way. And it's those collections in particular that are most at risk of disappearing forever. We asked the community at Photo Collections Network about vulnerable collections, and typically we got replies from someone who said they didn't think their collection was immediately at risk, but it was just one person in their 80s looking after it and hoping to retire. And worse, of course, collections that are sitting neglected in boxes in damp cellars or in imminent danger of disposal. And by the way, PCN also gets countless queries about different aspects of storing, preserving, cataloguing collections, presenting and displaying them and making them accessible for research and enjoyment. And that's not just from, mostly not from members of the public, if I can call them that, but from holders of small collections. So I think there's something that we at PCN and maybe anyone here can do to make something more useful. If we can create, as Debbie's described, a map or directory of collections and archives, then we can talk to anyone who wants to be on that map about building those that good practice to allow of storage, preservation, cataloguing to allow them to be on the map. And then, if they can take certain steps to share and present those collections for research and enjoyment, aren't they then well on the way to being part of a distributed national collection? If you pitch forward some years and imagine there's a dynamic and open map of the archives and collections of photography, as Debbie described, it seems to me that presents an opportunity to do what I've just described. Can I have the next slide, please? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Open data systems like Wikidata already exist that can be modified. For example, here's a live Wikidata map of all museums in the UK. When you click on any of the red dots, you see what is presently within the Wikidata item for that museum, and clicking on the individual link in the pop-up takes you to the Wikidata record for that museum. And Wikidata already consists of nearly 100 million objects. Could that map be overlaid with some sort of definition or structure or system? Could that then be used to start to think about redefining our national collections, not as state-owned collections of objects, but as an accessible, inclusive, and continually developing broad body of work? Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah. It was that moment, actually, a couple of years ago, I was talking about this to my mother, who is a keen gardener. And she said what I was describing sounded a little bit like the National Plant Collection Scheme. Bear with me, it's not as mad as it sounds. Let's take a look at that for a moment. If you don't know about it, it's a scheme run by a charity called Plant Heritage that aims to preserve and maintain the diversity and knowledge of garden plants. Next slide, please. What are the characteristics of Plant Heritage and National Plant Collection Scheme? Well, firstly, obviously, it's inherently distributed. The current 700 or so collections sit all around the country. A national plant collection can be linked to a person or a particular place, or most commonly to a genus or set of species. And the collection holder agrees to hold their collection in trust for the future. And I think that's a kind of critical phrase. So secondly, you can get involved at multiple different levels. Anyone can apply to become a plant guardian if you have a rare species in your own garden. And collections themselves can be defined in multiple different ways: horticultural, reference, scientific, or historical. And there are various well-defined criteria to get onto those lists. Next slide, please. So this, in turn, is a map of some of those collections. And I've just picked on one at random, which I don't know if you can read that, but it's Margaret Mckendrick. And she holds 4 species of Japanese anemones somewhere in Kent. And what's interesting about her is she lives in a perfectly ordinary house. She's a member of the public, but has agreed to hold that collection in trust. So interestingly, Plant Heritage publishes a list of missing genera and species and encourages anyone to apply to start anyone at all to start a national collection of that genus. By the way, top of the list at the moment of the missing genera are apricots and campanula. So if you've got those in your garden, have a look. Thirdly, it generates public interest and donations. Most people love plants and are willing to pay a small fee, and many are willing to pay a small fee to help their presentations. Multiple levels of membership, starting at £10 a year, rising to corporate bronze, silver and gold. It's not a perfect parallel, but I think at the Photo Collections Network, we're having a look to see if we can foster a system that looks a little bit similar. So next slide, please. So fairly recently, we surveyed the holders of private collections and archives of photography, and many of those people were either photographers themselves or their heirs and families. And one of the most frequently expressed desires was people wanting their works to be available to the public in the future. But sadly, that, as Debbie has said, doesn't happen as often as it could. Really significant how many old works end up being disposed of, which we'd like to do something about. And Debbie actually has done a lot of work, which she could answer questions on later if you're interested, at the W.W. Winters Archive on the problems of private collections going into the public domain. And she's worked on a trust model, which is a viable alternative to a straight transfer of ownership to the state. Not if I've got that right, Debbie.
It's sort of.
Yeah, it's a lot more subtle than that.
Yeah.
But I'm actually a big fan of using licensing models, and blockchain opens up other very interesting possibilities of ownership, licensing and blockchain in particular, with digital objects. But incidentally, have a look at the Whitworth Art Gallery, which has just issued or minted The Ancient of Days by William Blake as an NFT. So adapting some of the language from the plant collections, we might imagine a scheme something like this. With the National Photography Collections, individuals or organizations undertake to document, develop and preserve a collection of photographs in trust for the future. Collections are linked together, could be linked together in some way related to a community, geographical area, theme or genre. Who might hold a collection? Collection holders would voluntarily subscribe to the scheme's ideals and requirements. They'd come from every sector of photography, amateur and professional. And collection holders are passionate about the works in their care. They're experts and keen to share their expertise. We can speculate on different levels of collection holder and possibly photography guardians onto national collections of different types. I don't want to get into that level of detail at the moment. But the really important thing is that there is a clear path to get involved and a transparent process. The processes are primarily to maximize the sharing of good practice, which is what everyone in this room has, and to build public awareness and involvement of these potentially threatened and vulnerable collections. Who might oversee this whole process? Who makes all these decisions I'm talking about? Again, all I could say at the moment is it's really the whole sector or the community of interest. An important aim of the BCN is for, as I say, our expertise to be used to the broader public too. And digital technology can certainly help with the transparency I'm talking about. But a key thing, I think, is that future national collections are not necessarily publicly owned works, but they are held in trust for the future. The model of transfer of ownership to the state is a fine model, but it's not the only one. And we've talked about trust, licensing, and potentially blockchain. And using something like the models we're proposing, we would, I think, end up with a more dynamic, robust, open, accessible, distributed national collections of photography. So thank you. If we have the next slide, you can link again to the survey, but please drop us a line if you've got any questions. So thanks again to Debbie. And I don't know if you've got anything to add at this point, Debbie, but otherwise we go back to Catherine. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Debbie, and thank you indeed to everyone who has spoken as part of this panel. I think we will all be coming back onto the screen shortly. There we go. It's great to see a couple of questions starting to come through in the comments box. But just before we get to those, I have a few sort of broader thoughts of things that have come up across the panel and across these talks that we might get into initially. So we've obviously been discussing a broad range of institutional approaches with regards to digital photographic heritage, and ambition has varied across the examples and the contexts that have been addressed by these talks. But many are still quite traditional in terms of how they implement or engage with digital media and digital platforms. I can't help but feel that heritage institutions and overall could be being more experimental and looking towards examples that we can see at some museums or at other kinds of organisations about engagement with digital technologies and importantly digital cultures, because when we engage with digital technologies, we're engaging with this much broader set of cultures and behaviours that often plays out on the internet. But how straightforward is it really for institutions to simply make better use of digital technologies, and what do we mean by better use? And if this isn't straightforward, which it isn't, I think for various reasons, what are the things standing in the way?
I think digital technology allows granularity, it allows specificity, it allows us to drill down multiple levels. I suppose I'm not a great expert on APIs, but I assume we can link through from potentially one database to another that way. And so we get just much more rounded and complete way of looking at collections. But that's just from my perspective. Is that the kind of answer you're expecting, Catherine?
Yes and no. I think that there are examples of organisations and institutions. I'm thinking about particular museums that are focused on digital media as the sort of premise of what they do, or organisations like Forensic Architecture that engage with digital technologies just in a way that sort of steps back from the zoomed in view of databases and platforms, and thinks about digital technologies as actually a broader set of cultures that transcends the idea of a tool or a platform. And I'm just wondering if institutions, cultural heritage institutions, aren't traditionally known for being on the sort of cutting edge of this kind of thing. But I was wondering if why are we why are many organizations, and the trust is very much included in this, so why are we not being more ambitious with how we engage with digital technologies? What's standing in the way? Donna.
Thanks, Catherine. Look, it's interesting, and all those papers were fantastic. Thank you to everyone, and that was actually worked really well together. It's interesting because your question really is about an old way of thinking about how one might access collections, but it's also what you then do with them. So I worked at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, it was 2001 when they were starting their digitisation project of the collection. So 20 years later, it's of course advanced, but in those days it was really at the forefront, and the expense was enormous at the same time. So costs and all those things have changed. But really what I'm interested in, I suppose, in terms of your question, is in the ways in which people can connect with each other. So heritage collections, working with academics, for instance, who are working on digital humanities projects, and artists who think about things in a very different way, I think actually make a big difference in terms of the ways in which we can then think about collections and how they interconnect. So the examples that I gave, for instance, really think more holistically around collections, not just as images, but as cultural mediators. And I think Christo actually very aptly talked about that as well in terms of those collections. And that's what's important. It's not about looking at things on the internet. It's actually about how they bring other things to life. And it could be memories and histories of people that connect really quite profoundly with the ways in which we think about communities and the ways in which objects and images reflect those communities and actually connect quite strongly with them. So I think there are different ways of thinking about it, and I just don't think necessarily maybe the right people are talking to each other. I mean, in Sydney, in Australia, we've got some fabulous examples of how that is happening. And, I think maybe more conversations just need to happen.
Carrying on from Professor Donna's point, museums in particular have been looking after objects and ephemera for a very long time, and digital is incredibly new. And many of the models of way of working, in particular in my experience of working previously in museums, haven't been answered yet. How to acquire digitally born works is still a massive question. So actually how to show and make the use of digitized collections is part of this story. Museums for a really long time have been the repositories of our culture, or some areas of culture. Obviously there's lots of areas that aren't gathered and should be, and there's lots of questions there. But how they use and how we access and utilise digitised work is an ongoing question, with how we also acquire digitally born works. And I think they need to be really looked at together.
Can I, maybe there is also a question of, is it about the public, or is it about visitors, or is it about academics? Are we talking about, consulting a database, or then really getting a broader public engaged into the stories that, if it is museums, that museums want to tell? And there, of course, I think digital technologies, they can be incredibly interactive, and they can also make the visitor much more an active participant to the museum collection, or to the story, and so it is really. I think it is. We may not have reached this tipping point, but this all takes an incredible acceleration. So when I see the example of the museum in Luxembourg, so what has happened in the past 5 or 6 years, from really constituting online collections that you then can visit, to immersing the visitor into this collection. There are more steps still to be taken. I think this is what we see in Luxembourg is one form that it can take, but there is definitely so much to do, and there's so much also digital work happening that's very, very interactive.
I'll just add one more very short point, and I think it's in thinking about some of the work that we're doing and approaches in terms of how we make our collections available online, and what that does and how that works. And I think what's always been a really driving notion at the Trust, or with any other anthropological collections I've worked with in the past, is just that, are we utilizing the things that we have right now in the right way? And I kind of feel like the digitized version of that always comes quite last in the kind of hierarchy of needs in the museum world. And it's always about, how can we make as much knowledge available to share? How can we, facilitate as much of the community work that might need to be done at your institution, and how do you do that in an ethical, sensitive way? And I always feel like when it does come around to the digital part, it just feels very unformed in our minds. And I think that's because we haven't been always as sensitive or careful around our collections in the past. And I think there's a lot of work that it takes to kind of always be registering that kind of sensitivity. That I don't know that our cultural focus has kind of thought about what a digitized culture might need from us, and what those audiences are. Like, I don't know the makeup of those audiences. I don't know what forms those audiences. I know what kind of drives an academic understanding behind my kind of traditional vision of what significance means. And it's the communities and the people that are easily identifiable, whereas it's so hard to identify a kind of digital culture or a digital realm and what you might respond to for them. So I do feel like we're really ill-equipped at the Trust to even start responding to those particular audience needs.
And following on from that and thinking about cataloguing and digitization in particular, I think it's important to remember that ultimately this work plays out on the internet, but the internet itself is not neutral, and nor is it only a platform or tool, and online cultures are distinct from sort of real life. At institutions, I think we can focus on practical aspects of cataloguing and language, but how can we recognize and engage with the often politicized cultures of the internet where this work is often playing out?
I think I'll just quickly respond from a specific National Trust perspective. And I think really similar to what Paul and Debbie were talking about, I think we do a lot of work to try and reach out to people and get feedback. You know, there's, as you say, in the cataloging work, we do a lot of our own internal thinking and planning, and we get as many voices around the table as possible so that we can get as many different perspectives feeding into the process of how we might take things in the direction of travel. But we are a very public organization, and I think consultative practices are very much bred into the work that we do from the beginning. So, you know, we've had so much media backlash in this last year, and I think it's really been part of our approach to think, you know, are those people saying something that we can really learn from, that we can hopefully usefully integrate into the policies or approaches that we're using. And I think we do that in that very consultative way of, we try to do surveys, we try to get people involved, we have banners where we have email addresses where people can feed back from things that they see on the catalog, so that they always have a contact point and they can always kind of tell us what might be happening. And I think that's what we're trying to get towards in thinking through this image approach, at least, is to kind of set out the parameters of what we can and cannot do, what we can and cannot control, and what we're attempting to try and do, and always have a forum that people can feed back to us quite openly. And I mean, the people who feed back to you are never neutral themselves, and so that's always kind of a key factor in the thinking of how you integrate that in, is, you know, where was the background of where that information is coming from, and what can you take and then kind of evidenced useful case that can then be applied to the way you present images and information online.
I think also adding to that, it's not seeing collections as static. You know, they're categorized by the people that work with them at that time, but times change. There's some great projects that are happening all around the country that are looking back at collections and recategorizing, re-exploring them. Is the information recorded with them correct? Has context changed? Do we now look at things differently? And I think actually we need to work with more people and more communities to do that. I know with the Arts Council's Let's Create projects, they've also been encouraging museums to work with their local communities to re-look at their collections and really explore, is it meeting the needs of the community and how they categorise them. We've also at PCN been collaborating with a Museum of Youth Culture, who've been going into photographic archives and pulling out photographs that look at youth culture, which have never been categorized about that, and they're rediscovering it and again keywording it differently to enable people to look at the work differently. And I think that's something that needs to be constant. You know, history is fluid. If it's not this static thing that we need to keep in a box.
Paul.
Yeah, just to flag up one more thing about your question about digital work sort of playing out on the internet. I think we are not really yet at a point where we fully acknowledge the different levels of, if you like, privacy and access to digital material. There's an assumption that a digital object, just everyone can see it, which doesn't necessarily always want to be the case. And I think I just would flag that up as something we're thinking about with regard to sort of licensing and contracts and how digital work is distributed, because you know, and the IPO Intellectual Property Office talks about this as well, that there are different ways we can categorize digital material depending on who is going to see it. We don't necessarily want everything to be about, you know, there might be things that are quite private, but it might be good if some people saw them, sort of thing. I'm not trying to be exclusive here, but I'm just saying that is a fact about digital stuff, which I don't think we yet acknowledge. So one other little thing, this is slightly off track, but I'll say it. Did anyone mention the market? Because I think how the market deals with physical objects as opposed to digital objects is very interesting, and how that's developing. And I think museums have traditionally worked very closely with auction houses, and I don't work at either, so I don't really know. But I wonder if well, obviously the auction houses are starting to think more about digital objects, but whether that has a bearing on how the use of digital material develops.
And I just, and sort of speaking to that from my own institutional experiences, that I agree with what Christo said earlier, that I think that the biggest thing hamstringing institutions at the moment is infrastructure, and infrastructure to be able to mimic what is seen as core museum and core curatorial, core institutional tasks in a digital space that we have very sort of paper-based or store-based and box-based ways of doing for print-based collections, for example, or other collections that exist in as physical objects. And I don't know, I'm not sure that, I think auction houses work in a more responsive way, and that I think that there is always going to be a slight disconnect in the way that the market approaches digital objects and the way that institutions and museums approach digital objects, because of this question of the fundamental long-term infrastructure and sort of future-proofing what we're doing with our collections, and making sure that technologies aren't becoming obsolete, and making sure that we can honour public access, for example, when things are working across different digital formats. We've also, in the meantime, had a question from Kylie, who said she's been thinking about the connections between Christo's talk and Debbie and Paul's presentation. She's asking if Paul and Debbie, you might be able to speak about whether the recent debates about decolonizing heritage collections have impacted the approach of the PCN at all.
Thanks, Kylie. I mean, obviously it's enormous, and I think it's brilliant what you're describing, that's happening among collections, and we're absorbing that and understanding that. So I think one other possible thing to mention here is I'm also really keen on how archives and collections can be used effectively for anti-racism, for anti-discrimination. And we've started to explore, we had an interesting talk from Femi Nylander and Rob Lemkin about African Apocalypse, which is a story that starts, it's a documentary story that starts in a locked colonial archive in France, and goes on to unpick stories of colonial atrocities in Niger, which is very powerful. And perhaps I'm not sure how really true it is, but the idea of using archives in that way is fascinating as well. But I don't speak as an expert. I'm just, Debbie, I don't know if you've got anything to add on our approach to decolonizing archives.
I think the point I made earlier about, the context and the histories attached to work should always be available to be updated and recontextualized. And also the project that we're doing isn't about digitizing every image in the collections. It's about a directory of where the collections are and who's holding them and how we access them. So a lot of the data that we'll be gathering will actually be linked to directly to the institutions. But I think the debates about how work is seen, what work is shown, what it means, how it's categorized is always something that should be questioned.
And Christo, you have this experience working across a multi-site organisation like the Trust, and we're not talking a handful of sites, we're talking hundreds of sites, and the complications and the realities that are attached to that. Do you sort of have any thoughts? Because in many ways there are resonances between that multi-site nature of the Trust and the network that Paul and Debbie are trying to establish. And do you have any thoughts about the particular complications that can come with community-based work, for example, when you're working across multiple organizations, multiple sites in one organization?
Yeah, there's a lot of complications. I think to be, just quite honest here, it's a very friendly academic forum, so we can just discuss ideas and thoughts and things that we think that are really important to engage with. And I guess I can only be quite clear in saying that decolonization as a practice, it's something that's the kind of underlying groundwork of everything I do and pervasive in all the ways I'm thinking about collections and photography specifically. But I wouldn't say that means it's a pervasive approach for everyone at the National Trust. And the way we work is that we have all of these individual historic houses, and they have quite a lot of agency themselves. Each of them are their own individual museums at times. They are their own devolved model of governance, and they can make their own decisions about what they want to do with their collections. And really all I can do is advise them about best practice and what might be a good approach towards, being as kind of up to date with these kinds of practices as possible. So there are a lot of tensions in that, because there's a lot of perhaps convincing to do for people who don't even agree that these are the approaches that we should implement. And also I think as I was trying to express in my presentation, there is a bit of a tension around this idea of, we know that language is going to keep evolving. Like Debbie said, practices are going to keep evolving, histories are going to keep evolving. And I think that was a pervasive kind of theme from everybody's presentation. And I think kind of keeping that momentum is really difficult as things continue to change and evolve, especially if you're trying to do it across over 300 individual houses who might come with their own sense of what a collection should be and how it should be engaged with. And then a really practical point is that, there's so much diversity of community opinion in terms of what should happen with collections. It can be really hard to find some kind of homogenous view that then makes it easily applicable to what you want to do with your photographic collections and how you treat them. And what I've really come to experience is it takes so much time to formulate those relationships and to keep them long term. And honestly, there's a lot of institutional turnover. There's lots of people come and go and they leave. And once those relationships have kind of disintegrated a bit, it becomes really difficult to, instantiate them again and to get them kind of rolling so that people are feeding into processes in a realistic way. So I don't know, I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that it's a very a complex process, and it can be really difficult in a really large institution.
And actually related to notions of colonialism and empire is that a few of the talks today address the military, which is an inherently politicized entity. I guess this is more relevant towards Donna and Francoise. with the subject of your talks. And I guess I'm wondering if you've come across any ethical questions or concerns in relation to working with images that address military warfare or military history, and what these things say and do regarding national political constructs.
Donna, do you want
So Catherine, I might answer that first, I suppose, is yes, I suppose the difficulty with working with images from so say the postcards or the family photographs, the citizen photographs from Operation Overlord, is that there are still descendants who are alive, and perhaps even people who are in those photographs. So it's about thinking, I suppose, in terms of the sensitivities that there might be involved in reproducing images of those people. So I suppose in terms of the Imperial War Museum, that would be a concern for them. But then also thinking about the ways in which people donated those images, 10 million of them, for the purpose of the invasion, already intimates that those people knew or thought that they would be in the public sphere. So I suppose in some ways, some of the sensitivities in which we think about things now is actually quite different to the ways in which they would have been thought of in the initial usage of those images. So I think we need to kind of think about what the balance might be there in terms of access, because the more you actually put online, and the Powerhouse Museum in Australia and various other places have done that, where they've actually put images up, and the connections back to those communities and the people who are in those photographs have actually come to the fore, and that is Indigenous communities as well as non-Indigenous communities. So you end up in some ways, I think, crowdsourcing knowledge about those images, which I think is really interesting. The other major project I've been working on for years is the Stasi archive, and that is incredibly difficult to deal with in terms of the ways in which you can use those images. So, they are largely redacted. So I was talking about redaction in, Lena's work, but in terms of the supply of those images, the faces are always pixelated. So, because that's in fact even closer to home for many people. So there are lots of sensitivities there, and I think the ways in which archives deal with that is quite different across different collections. There doesn't seem to be necessarily any kind of cohesive and consistent approach to that. So there are difficulties and sensitivities there. Yeah.
I agree. I mean, there are definitely sensitivities in the case of Luxembourg. I mean, that's always the case here. Our archives are much smaller, so the volume, is, of course, when you talk about millions of photographs, and you have, I don't know, 1,000. I don't know exactly. I mean, for the fortress, for instance, it's a collection of 120 photographs, and they're basically landscapes and views of the fortress. And not much of the 19th century photography exists in Luxembourg. So that is a completely different issue. But there it was more the creating the awareness that at some point, I mean, in the history of Luxembourg, the country was that fortress and was so very intrinsically linked to military history. And so to imagine, to project yourself back into that time, to me, I think has been something of a revelation through these images. So that it's a bit of a reverse example. And then for the Legionnaires, I know that this has been a 5-year project, a research project. So of course you could also there have an in-depth research and contextualize the photographs also that were chosen in the end, also for these huge multimedia murals. So you will find them back at some point or another in the exhibition, and they will be explained, what they are about. And that's something that I find quite interesting. I mean, this network, or this kind of working together the museum with the collection, and then the research institution, and then still in collaboration with artists or multimedia artists who come up with a different way of looking at the collection, or of conveying the meaning of the collection to the public.
We're getting quite close to the end of our time, but we've had another question from Sebastian, which we'll address before ending. It was in response to our conversation earlier about how institutions are engaging with digital technologies, on a, thinking about that from a sort of broader ambition level. And he said, I wonder if many museum workers, due to the primacy of objects in the field, are often reluctant to challenge this. And I think by this, he means the wider institutional approach towards digital technologies. He continued, the pandemic has changed this hugely, even though directors of major nationals continue to highlight the primacy of objects. What will collections take from this moment of digitized objects online? And it seems like many museums are playing catch up in launching online, and have been during the pandemic. Debbie?
I know from my experience in working in museums, one of the big challenges which we've been trying to help address as well at PCN is storage, because storage is so temporary of anything digital. You put something on a hard drive or a cloud server, it's going to have to be updated in a few years. I've spent also years working in contemporary galleries that regularly shows digital work, and we've had issues with work that's a few years old that's needed recoding just to be shown. So I think lots of museums are interested and engaging, and exciting things are happening in the sector with digital, but also the knowledge gaps of how you store, care for, regularly access digital work is such a big question, and always shifting and changing, that there's a real fear about really diving in. And then the other question that I all like to pose, especially from an environmental point of view, just because we can digitize, does it mean we should? Because digitization always has a carbon footprint. It takes up real space on servers, which takes up electricity and often uses fossil fuels. I've spoken to lots of archives and institutions who have digitized works that have never had a single click on it. Lots of works are popular and are accessed, but who is accessing the digitized work and why? It's really good for us to explore what people want to explore, why they're exploring it. Now, just because no one's accessing it now doesn't mean that people won't in the future. So that's not necessarily a reason not to digitize it, because maybe you need to get it out there for it to be wanted and worked with and recategorized and talked about. But it's a thing that we need to be constantly exploring. Should everything be digitized because of the environmental cost, and also because we are still working out how things are stored and accessed long term?
That's a very good point, Debbie, and I think very pertinent as well, thinking about especially the National Trust's remit in relation to sustainability and the environment. We have come to the end of our allotted time, so I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone in this panel for your fascinating talks and for this discussion afterwards. And I think we are going to see Gil again just to wrap up this day of the conference and introduce what we can expect tomorrow.
Yeah, so thank you very much to all the session panelists for your wonderful, insightful talks, and thank you, Catherine, for chairing the session and the Q&A, and thank you, of course, to the viewers for your questions from the other side of the screen. So this is the end of day one of our conference. We will continue with two more panel sessions tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. That is UK time zone, with a panel on communities. At the end of that panel, around 11 a.m. UK time, we will take a 2-hour break until 1 p.m., which is also when we shall introduce the conference's final panel on the theme of the political. We hope you found today's session thought-provoking and relevant to your own interest, and we very much look forward to welcoming you back tomorrow morning. Have a good evening in the meantime, and thanks for watching us.